According to the official records, the evacuation was complete. The report was finalized, signed, and archived. Every checkpoint had been cleared. Every route had been checked. The system showed 0 remaining civilians inside the restricted area. From an administrative perspective, the incident was over. The file was closed. This wasn't a guess or an assumption. It was a conclusion supported by logs, timestamps, and confirmations entered by multiple agencies. Each step of the evacuation process had been marked as successful. Each zone had been labeled empty. On paper, there was no one left. The first hours after the evacuation were uneventful. Emergency personnel stood down. Monitoring was reduced. Some equipment was powered off entirely. The resources that had been deployed in large numbers were gradually reassigned elsewhere. That is how these operations are designed to end. But what the records didn't show was that the system had made a critical assumption, one that no longer matched reality. The evacuation relied on confirmations coming from several layers: transport logs, checkpoint counts, and manual acknowledgments from field teams. Each layer worked correctly on its own. The problem wasn't a single failure, but the way those confirmations were combined. People were counted when they passed through checkpoints. Vehicles were logged when they exited the zone. But no system existed to independently verify that everyone who entered a vehicle also left it at the destination. Once a person was logged as in transit, the system treated them as removed from danger. That distinction mattered. As the evacuation progressed, conditions were chaotic. Visibility was limited. Communications were strained. Some groups were moved more than once. Others were redirected at the last moment. In several cases, people were separated from family members during transfers. The system recorded movements, not outcomes. By the time the final report was generated, the numbers aligned. The expected count matched the logged exits. From a data perspective, the operation was clean. In reality, it wasn't. The first indication that something was wrong came hours later, from a source that wasn't part of the evacuation workflow at all. A routine follow-up check, conducted for an unrelated reason, detected signs of human presence inside the restricted area. At first, it was dismissed as a sensor error. The area had been cleared. The records were clear. There was no reason to believe anyone remained. A single anomalous reading wasn't enough to reopen a closed case. But then another indication appeared. And then another. Independent systems, not connected to the evacuation logs, began to suggest that movement was still occurring where none should exist. These systems had not been shut down because they were not classified as emergency assets. They were never meant to detect people. Now they were. When responders returned to verify the readings, they didn't expect to find anyone. The assumption was that the system was wrong, not the records. What they found instead was silence, and then signs that someone had been there recently. Personal items, makeshift shelter, evidence of prolonged presence. Someone had not left. As the search expanded, it became clear that this was not an isolated case. Multiple individuals had never exited the zone. Some had been missed during transfers. Others had been incorrectly logged as evacuated due to procedural shortcuts taken under pressure. In one documented instance, a checkpoint confirmation had been entered manually to keep traffic moving, based on an estimate rather than an actual count. The discrepancy was small enough to go unnoticed at the time. Later, it mattered. The records were revisited, this time with the assumption reversed. Instead of asking whether the system was correct, investigators asked where it could have gone wrong. They found that once a section of the evacuation was marked complete, it was effectively locked. Subsequent updates did not trigger alerts unless they exceeded predefined thresholds. Minor inconsistencies were absorbed by the system and treated as noise. The system was designed for efficiency, not uncertainty. By the time the oversight was fully acknowledged, hours had passed. Conditions inside the restricted area had deteriorated. The people who remained were exposed to the same risk the evacuation had been meant to eliminate. They had followed instructions as long as they could. When guidance stopped, they waited. When assistance didn't arrive, they adapted. None of that appeared in the records. Public statements focused on the success of the evacuation as a whole. Officials cited high compliance rates and rapid response times. The case was presented as an example of effective coordination under pressure. The discrepancy was addressed quietly. Internally, the incident triggered a review of how evacuation complete was defined. The phrase, it turned out, meant something very specific in the system. It did not mean that every person was accounted for. It meant that the expected process had finished. Expectation had replaced verification. No single individual was held responsible. The error emerged from the interaction between procedures, assumptions, and time pressure. Each step made sense in isolation. Together, they produced a false conclusion. The records said everyone left. The reality was more complicated. In later revisions of the system, additional safeguards were added: cross-checks, redundancies, manual confirmations that could not be bypassed. The language used in reports was softened, leaving more room for uncertainty. But none of those changes applied retroactively. For the people who remained behind, the distinction between evacuated and log as evacuated was meaningless. They had trusted that being counted meant being safe. The system had moved on without them. And the most unsettling part of the